This section is on the rise of the Caliphate. So, just as a quick vocab issue, remember Caliph means successor. Successor to who? Successor to Muhammad. And a caliphate is a government in which a state is governed by caliphs. Right? So when I say a caliphate, I mean a government, an Islamic government governed by a caliph. So one thing I want to stress is that you'll recall Muhammad was successful. He went from Medina to conquer Mecca, and then under him, Islam would spread. It will continue to spread under his successors, right? You may remember we talked about how they actually get all the way to Spain and to France. And they will also destroy the Persian Empire. So they do really well in terms of the military conquest. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at that expansion. So we have this question then, how did the conquest begin and why was it so successful? Well, remember there was a custom of raiding among the tribes. This was just kind of a normal thing you did to your neighbors. You raided them. It was just assumed that this is what you did. And Abu Bakr seems to have followed this. And there was no sense that you needed a reason to do this, right? They're your neighbor. They're not an ally with you. It's okay to go out and attack them and take their stuff. And so Abu Bakr started raiding against the Byzantine Empire and against the Persian Empire. And these were just raids. Just go in, smash and grab, take some stuff and leave. But Abu Bakr and later caliphs find that the Byzantine and Persian empires were actually quite weak. Why? Well, they had been fighting each other for several decades. They had had a massive war that had lasted for decades, and they were exhausted. I mean, it's as simple as that. The Byzantines, barely won the war. But other than that, they didn't really get that much out of it. So they're tired, they're exhausted, they're, in a sense, declining, while this new Arab caliphate state, won't be Arab for long, will include lots of other people, is getting stronger. So this allows a lot of conquest, right? You know now that your enemy is weak, so why not go out and conquer them? And that's exactly what Abu Bakr and his successors will do. Now, what's key about this? So one thing that's really striking is very early on, Muslim forces, or I should say Islamic forces, because we'll see they're not all Muslims, Islamic forces are going to have a navy and defeat the Byzantine navy. And that's kind of shocking, right? Because, I mean, weren't the Arabs all dwelling in the desert and were nomadic pastoralists? How the heck did they figure out how to build a navy and defeat the Byzantine Empire, which had a really good navy and had been doing this for decades? And the answer to that question is it wasn't just Arab Muslims doing this. Ethnic and religious minorities within the Persian Empire and within the Byzantine Empire both believed that they would be treated better by new rulers and supported them. So it wasn't that the Arabs just alone built up a navy to defeat the Byzantine Empire. They had help from ethnic and religious minorities that had been oppressed in the Byzantine Empire. And the same thing kind of happens with the Persian Empire as well. And one thing, I just point to this particular battle, the Battle of Chains. It's called this because the Persian Empire, its forces, were literally chained together. They sent their infantry into battle and they were all chained together. And the argument was it was supposed to help them keep unit cohesion. I think it's to prevent the soldiers from running away. And you can bet that when you're doing that, maybe it's time for a change in management. So the fact was, not only was the Byzantine and Persian Empire weak already from a war, there were people within their empire, we've talked about this in empires, that, were not happy with being a part of their empires. And they said, maybe this new caliphate, maybe it will treat us better. And so they supported them. And one thing about these early initial Islamic conquests was they were relatively lenient. Now, I don't want you to think that there wasn't any burning or looting and killing. There certainly was. But once that was over, for the most part, the Muslim conquerors would take from the very wealthy. They left the middle and lower people basically alone. And if you were willing to pay a religious tax, you could keep your religion. Now, that was a significant tax, and no one likes paying a tax. But I don't want you to think that in this time period, Muslims were going around saying to Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians, you have to convert to Islam or we're going to kill you. That's not what they were saying. They said you have to convert to Islam or pay a tax. And one thing that makes this really, one thing I want to stress, they're going to be second-class citizens. I mean, Muslims are going to get the privileges in society. In many, in Islamic society, if you were Christian or Jew, you couldn't be armed. You typically couldn't ride a horse, or at least you had to ride the horse like side saddle, like a woman, instead of like a soldier would. You're not equal, but you're also not being killed for being a Christian or a Jew, and you could do quite well, as we'll talk about in another section. So this is complex. And what's interesting is a lot of times the Islamic conquerors were more interested in collecting the religious tax than in conversion. They weren't necessarily all that interested in getting Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians to convert, because paying the religious tax brought in a significant amount of money. But in any case, they are going to be successful. They are expanding against two empires that are relatively weak and who have internal problems. And that's going to help in the Islamic expansion. And I should also point out just Muslims, these Arab warriors were just really good at being warriors. They were good fighters. So the Caliphate, right? We can now talk a little bit more about the establishment of the Caliphate. So you can get a sense of their conquest in that when the Caliphate decides to establish a political capital, it doesn't do it in Mecca. Mecca is important religiously, but politically it's far away from the wealthiest parts of their expanding empire. They put it in Damascus in Syria, which points to them being oriented more towards the Mediterranean Ocean. And this new caliphate will be institutionalized under what's called the Umayyad. The problem is the Umayyad caliphate, and this is kind of like a dynasty when I say Umayyad, they're going to discriminate against non-Arab Muslims. So as the Arab conquests continue, some of the people they're conquered say, I don't want to pay the tax. I would much rather become a Muslim. So for example, there'll be large numbers of Persians who will convert to Islam. And in other areas, other ethnic groups will also convert to Islam. But the Umayyad Caliphate doesn't want to bring them in, doesn't want to give them high positions or anything like that. They want to keep power mostly for the Arabs. Now, in a sense, you could say that's ethnic discrimination. I think there's also the sense of we were Muslims first and you guys converted after, we conquered you. So how sincere are you? Right? I think that might be an issue. But in any case, just as the Byzantines and the Persians had minorities, ethnic and religious minorities who weren't happy, you had the same thing developing within Islamic Caliphate. And what will happen is a group of Arabs and Persians and other people who feel discriminated against are going to overthrow the Umayyad Caliphate and establish the Abbasid Caliphate, which is much more open to bringing in Muslims of any ethnic group, right? They're not going to be so interested in saying you have to be Arab. And this is one thing that's very important for us to understand. A lot of times when people think Islam, they think Arab, and that makes sense because most Arabs are Muslims, but not all. There's, for example, Christian Arabs. But Arabs are a minority in Islam today, and they were quickly becoming, in a sense, a minority. They weren't going to be the dominant ethnic group in Islam for long. And this new caliphate will establish its capital in Baghdad, right? In Baghdad. And that shows more of a Eastern Persian center because Baghdad's not that far from Persia. So now we have a new capital built in Baghdad. We will next see what the Caliphate and Islamic civilization will do with it.